So what I wanted to talk about this morning was really kind of setting up the code plugs. And after I've been doing DMR for a long time now, and the one thing I didn't realize is you really have to think about, prepare to set up the code plug and decide what it is you want out of the code plug before you spend hours and hours and days setting up repeaters and talk groups and stuff on a code plug that you'll never use. And they're kind of a complete waste of time when you do it that way, because not only will you never use it, but you have so much information available to you. You get lost within all the different zones and talk groups on your radio. So this is kind of how to set up a code plug and to think about how you're going to set it up. So when you start talking about the code plug, first real question is, what local repeaters do you really need? And if you're never going to go to Southern California, there's no point in having a Southern California repeater in your code plug. It just doesn't make sense. And it's more channels you have to walk through. It's more zones you have to walk through. It increases the complication of your code plug. And it's just the simpler you keep these, not only the easier they are, but the faster they actually work. So if you don't really care about all the other people's IDs, if you don't really care and you're only going to work on 2 repeaters or 3 repeaters, limit your code plug to that, because things do run better. And when they add and subtract talk groups, you have a whole lot of, it's a lot easier just to take one talk group out of one repeater or add one talk group to 1 or 2 repeaters rather than to 30 or 40 repeaters, which is the way I used to do things. And I realized I never used 90% of what was in the code plug. The second real thing is, are you going to use a hotspot? And the reason you do that is because on hotspots, you have to set them up a little bit differently. And your talk groups in the hotspot are going to be a lot greater in volume and number than they will with repeaters. So you have to kind of think about, how do I really want to utilize this hotspot? What do I really want to do with it? You pick the talk groups. There are talk groups like TAC 10, TAC 11, TAC 12, TAC 13, TAC 14, TAC 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That you'll probably never hear any traffic on. So they take up a zone. You have to step through them. It's a whole lot of stuff out there that you have to go through to get those talk groups activated. And quite honestly, you'll probably never use them, so why have them? If you have no interest in the constant QSOs in the worldwide talk group, the worldwide talk group, although it's interesting, a steady stream of it day by day. If you're into 1-minute QSOs, where you say, hi, where are you? And they'll tell you, and then you say, okay, I'm in California. And they go, good, have a nice day, 73s. If you like that kind of stuff, and a lot of people do, it's great, but if you don't do that, then don't put that talk group in there. Just don't need it, okay? And the big, what repeaters have with what talk groups. And the last one, I think, I just got to make sure here, is where do you commute? If you commute from here to, I go to Point Richmond right now every day. So I set up my code plugs for Point Richmond to my house in San Ramon, back and forth. So I have San Francisco repeaters on there. I've got some Oakland stuff on there, et cetera, et cetera. And I set it up in such a way with scanning that I can monitor all these different repeaters as I'm driving up and down 580 and 680 and 24 and stuff like that. And my code plug's really designed for that now. And I have a local, what I call a local commute code plug. It's really, you go to that zone, that's all that's in there. It's my drive back and forth to San Ramon every day and the different talk groups I like to listen to and the different analog stations I like to listen to. So any questions so far? Have I confused everybody? Guess not. Okay. So
I was going to say, is everybody clear with the difference between zones, talk groups, and channels? Because that's probably the single hardest thing.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in just a few minutes here. Always save the original code plug. When you buy a brand new radio or buy a used radio with a known to work code plug, Make sure you save it, you preserve it, you put it on a drive, you keep it someplace safe. Because when you brick your radio or come close to bricking your radio, you will need that original code plug. It's got all the settings, it's got everything you need. And I've bricked a few radios over the years, and with those code plugs on the Motorola radios I own, sometimes you can actually restore them and getting back to a state where the settings are okay now. It's corrected whatever stupid setting mistake you made, and you can actually bring the radio back to life. I'm a big fan of Connect Systems right now because they have a firmware patch that you can brick your radio, do anything you want to it, and with this firmware patch, you'll actually restore it and bring it back to life. I've had the Kenwoods. I've had a bunch of radios that I can't say the radio survived after I did a few things to it. I am one of those experimenters where I'll go ahead and change settings to see what happens. And sometimes it doesn't work out in my benefit, but sometimes it's real interesting what happens. So save your original code plug, save your midstream work, which means as you're adding talk groups, as you're adding channels, as you're adding zones, save it constantly. Just every few times you enter something in there and you've changed it, update your code work so that you don't lose it. These radio programs from the radio manufacturers are not real savvy. And unlike, if you've got Word, you know how it saves everything for you? It just every 30 seconds or a minute or whatever, it goes and saves it for you. Yeah, these programs don't work that way. They'll just, you're dead in the water. If you can be sitting there for an hour and make all kinds of changes, the system locks up or you get distracted, you punch the wrong key, and boom, all that 1 hour of work, 2 hours of work are suddenly gone. So not only save your original code plug, but as you're coding, save your midstream work under different revisions levels. You will update and modify your code plugs. It's constant, and it's as you get used to things, you get better and better and more efficient with it. And then there's something called a super code plug that's available for a couple of other different radios. I don't recommend these because there's so much junk in them that it makes the radios run a little bit slower. It's got all kinds of links and stuff in it that can become problematic after a while because the code plugs fall out, the repeaters fall out, and you just don't even know where to look for where the problems are. And you end up going back and getting another version of the super code plug to fix it. But the super code plugs are really, I see those more as people who really don't like the technical side of radio but want to talk a lot. So they buy the super code plugs because they just don't want to mess with setting up a code plug, doing the actual hand coding on it. And that's fine. It's just, it does have its limitations. It does have its problems. And you do go through an awful lot of zones when you're operating your radios. And I'll show you zones and everything here in a few minutes. So you want to make the list, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about talk groups, those repeaters that handle those talk groups. How do I keep track of things? Using a most commonly used channel or zone. Using events-only channels or zones. And then scan roam. What's that all about? Analog and digital mixing of a code plug. This is one that always kind of mystifies me. Everybody likes analog in one zone, and then they put the digital in another zone. Now, you can do that, that's fine, but there's really no need for it. So if you're at a public service event and they're using both digital and analog, you want to have all those in the same zone. You don't want to be flipping between the different zones, because when you do that, you have to go find the right channel, put it on the right channel. It's very time consuming, and sometimes you want to get to the right channel really quick. And if you have these things in a common zone, life gets really easy. So, and then there's a power on and home, and what that is what channel do you listen to most often, and what do you want to appear on your radio when you turn it on? So you can actually set up in all these DMR radios, when you turn it on, what channel you're going to be on, and if you push the home button, what channel and or zone are you going to be on. It saves you a lot of time, and it makes you a lot happier when you get in the car after a hard day's worth of work. My default is the 5150 Club. I love listening to them. They're all out of their minds, so I have a lot in common with them. And Anarchy, they're really great guys on there. That's the ones I really do. So basically my power on and home is the Anarchy and the 5150 group. Any questions? Good? Or somebody shake their head yes? Yeah, okay. Somebody shook their head yes, so you guys are listening. I haven't put you to sleep. Okay, so another thing that's good is plagiarism is your best friend. And you have a friend, a club member, somebody who has the same radio or similar model you do. You can search the internet for code plugs and pick a plug for any model of radio will do usually. And you see that BridgeCon Systems, that's one place. The one below that, the Groups IO, by the way, there's several Groups IO. They're old. It's a takeoff of the old Yahoo group. There's a bunch of Groups IO that have code plugs out there. You just need to look for them. And then Baynet has posted a couple of code plugs recently. And I've played with a few of them. They're really well done code plugs. And they're for radios that are pretty common, that probably most of you have. And it will save you a lot of time when you start setting up your own code plug. The trick is to understand by basically not experiencing the pain that other people did, that when they set up their code plugs, they had to learn how to do this stuff. Oh, it says Livermore Lark has a Groups IO subgroup. How about that? I didn't even know that. Wow. Okay. So let me get rid of that. Okay. So anyway, let me move on to the next slide. Maybe. There we go. And I put these in here for a couple reasons. These are all links and leads to different websites that if you use these, things will run better. They'll just run a lot faster. You'll get, and these will all be available in the recording of the session and stuff. Most of these are local. You got Baynet, NorCal, DMR net. There's some stuff up there that's of interest. And then Anarchy, which is my favorite one. It's got the skull and crossbones and everything else. It's something Ian threw together. And it talks about their group and how it works and why it's a very special group, et cetera, et cetera. So you can take a look at those and learn and experience, get information about the different groups and zones and everything else out there. And it'll just help you get up to speed a whole lot faster. The Carlos, everybody know the Carla radio group? This is a couple of guys, that's a bunch of guys, that have radios up and down the state of California, radios in other states. They're VHF, UHF. Most of them are analog. And I kid you not, you hit 30 or 40 repeaters when you key up on a local repeater. There's one in Walnut Creek. There's another one down in the Livermore, Pleasanton area. And when you key up on it, it triggers repeaters across the state and into other states. It's a real interesting group. Their main purpose in life is to have a backup, solid, if everything goes to hell in a handbasket, you could still go ahead and use the Carla radio net to communicate, and they work in clusters. So even if half their repeaters got taken out by a magnetic pulse or something, the other half would still stay up and running. So it's a real interesting group. If you haven't seen their website, it's definitely worth reading and going through it. They're always looking for help. They're always looking for money to help them because they've got, I bet it's not short of well over $1 million worth of equipment out there. And then the monthly fees for the commercial sites that they have and the U.S. Forest Service fees, it adds up quickly. And I don't know how in the world they finance it all, but somehow they do it. Then there's the Groups IO, NorCal DMR messages. And this is somebody put together. There's a lot of guys from the Mount Diablo group that use this one. And it's got some interesting information in it. I check it on a weekly basis just to see if things have changed because talk groups go and come and fall off and stuff like that. It's just a great place for referencing things. So does everybody know what a dynamic talk group is? Everybody know what that is?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, everybody knows? So I don't have to tell you?
I don't know.
I'm brand
You
new.
don't know. Okay. So there's two types. Now, I call them dynamic and static, but there's other talk groups too. But the simplest way I got this dynamic one is a push to talk. And what that really means is when you push your microphone down and you hold it a second, you'll hear a beep. Okay? And that beep means, yeah, you're on the time slot. Yeah, you're on the channel, and you can talk now. It's a courtesy tone. But what it actually does is it sets up a timer, and depending on the talk group that you're on or depending on the repeater you're on, that talk group will hold that group for you and hold the repeater for a period of less than 5 minutes. And if you're using it as a tactical channel, that's all you need, right? It's you get on, you get a message across, you go away, you come back, whatever it happens to be. But you basically get that across. If it's a quiet day and you're going to use the channel a lot for the TAC group a lot, you just make sure you keep keying up on it every 3 to 5 minutes or whatever the timer is set for so you can hold that resource open. Does that make sense? It's a very confusing piece of this hobby. Okay. And then you have the static talk groups. So these are set up by something called a C bridge. And I'm not going to get into that because it's just really complicated, and I don't fool with C bridges, so I don't really care about them too much. Hang on, we got visitors in a minute. Hello. We're right in the middle of the event, so okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. We had a visitor. Nothing like working an event and doing other things at the same time. So you got these talk groups, and one of the talk groups that's static that has a timer on it, it leaves it open, and you can hear it most of the time, is the worldwide one. And it's just running all the time so that when you want to get onto it, it's probably already been selected, the resources available, and you will hear traffic on it. And that timer just runs constantly, and it leaves that resources of those channels open for you at all times. And you can just go ahead and listen to it if you want. We're going to talk a little bit about how other groups work around the dynamic and the static talk groups and how they can prioritize channels. So we're going to do an event later this year where we're going to jump on one of the channels and use 3 or 4 repeaters in order to have some communications during the event and be able to talk literally through 3 repeaters at one time using their push-to-talk group, but using them in such a way that it's in the same time slot with no one else. And we'll talk about time slots here in a minute. I hope this isn't getting too confusing. I tried to keep this simple. All right. So that's kind of the end of the presentation. What I wanted to do now is put my glasses on, okay? And we're actually going to look at some code plugs because that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of the whole thing. And let me pull that back up. Yeah, I need this one. Okay. Do that. All right, so you should see on your screen something that says designated home channel in the bottom left-hand corner. Anybody see that?
Yeah,
okay, we're seeing it. Okay, so this is a code plug that I was editing this morning, and the vehicle I'm in, we actually have 3 DMR radios in here, and these are code plugs for these radios. Is what we're doing. And having multiple DMR radios, you'll find out it isn't that unusual that you'll have a handheld and you'll have a mobile and maybe one in the house. It's not that it kind of grows on you after a while. The other way around that is to use your handhelds and use hotspots. And if you only want to have one radio, you want to use the hotspot. We'll talk more about the hotspots in just a minute here. So anyway, this particular page that I was on, let me just point out a couple of things. When our radios pull up, when you first turn them on, we want them to say San Ramon Valley Fire Protection District. That's what that SRV FPD is. That's what it stands for. And then the power on message too is for DMR radio. And it does not look very nice. It pulls up when you power it on. Looks very nice and official, and people go, ooh, ah, and we like that. So that's why we have it set up that way. But down here is the radio ID, and because the department has 5 DMR radios, we have 5 different IDs. And the IDs are really, really important because that's actually what connects you to Brandmeister and other networks. So every radio that you have that will be turned on at the same time as another radio has to have its own unique ID. So what I mean by that is this, is if you've got a mobile unit in your car and you've got an HT and you know you're not going to communicate, you're not going to push the microphone button when you're in the car, okay? And I'm sorry, you won't use your mobile radio at the same time you use your handheld as far as transmitting goes. If you know if you know it's going to operate that way, then you only need one radio ID. But if you loan your radio to George, and you know George is going to be talking to you on that radio ID, and you talk back to him on the radio ID, you run into a problem they call bounce. And if you do it often enough, it'll actually not let you communicate for an hour. And I've actually done this, playing with the radios to see what would happen. It turns out it really does work that way. They will shut you down for an hour, and they did it a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's changed much since then. So you can get all these radio ID numbers you need. And if you think the way I do is I have 5 radios, I have 5 different ID numbers, and then I have 4 more radios in the house and stuff that I use off and on. And just because I loan those out, I actually have 4 more ID numbers too. So I have a total of 9 ID numbers that I'm responsible for. And when I say responsible for, the biggest problem with having multiple radio IDs is every time you change your code plug, if you're going to be loading the code plug to several different radios, before you push that program key, you've got to go in there and change this number for that radio, because every radio has a unique identification. If you only have 1 or 2 radios and they never key up at the same time, it's not a problem. Don't worry about it. But if you do have multiple radios, and there's a really good chance you're going to be keying up at the same time or close proximity, you've got to have the different numbers or bad things happen, because you'll sit there and go, why doesn't this radio work? And then you'll start doing things to it, and then suddenly it recovers because it timed out. And you go, oh, yeah, that's right. That's how that works. Okay.
Hey, Chris.
And then, yes.
So are they still issuing, or can you still get multiple radio IDs under the same ham radio license registration?
Absolutely. So if you go to radioid.net, I think it is, and I have it on a previous slide here, it's basically a self-serve function. And if you want multiple IDs, you just go ahead and send a note to tech support, and you say, I'm going to need 5 IDs because I have 5 radios, and here's my situation. And then you self-generate the radio ID numbers. They just say you can have up to 5, and then you generate your own numbers. It's pretty straightforward. If you can program a code plug, you can definitely get the radioids.net. And the radioids.net has got a lot of other cool stuff I want to show you today. Have you guys been on radioid.net at all?
Well, yeah, I got my DMR ID that way.
Okay. Did you notice all the other things that were on there?
I haven't really played around with that much other than downloading the Northern California directory to save memory, or the directory of users for Northern California or the United States. Other than that, I haven't really played around with it.
That's one of the things I was going to say. So it actually has a worldwide list of all the users. But if you put that worldwide list into your radio will run slower because I think it's something like 43,000 lines on a spreadsheet. And I've loaded it a couple of times into radios, but it was kind of a stupid idea. So I do what Steve does, which is I just get local stuff, and I go ahead and program in those IDs. Or in some cases, I have radios that I don't even bother with it because I just hand the radios out to people and they use them. And it really doesn't matter if I ever update the who's listening list on the other side. So anyway.
Sorry, can I ask you?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, so on a 878 here in front of me, which I haven't done anything with yet, glad to listen in this morning. So the radio ID is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I was just seeing is the default. I mean, if everybody's radio is defaulting to that, and presumably some number of people never change, do you have to change radio ID in order to use these, or
your radio won't work on Brian. Your radio will not work network correctly if you don't.
Okay, so it's only if you're trying to use the digital functions, the talk groups. Otherwise it's an analog radio if you're just using it as analog, right?
Yeah, if you're just using it for analog, it doesn't care.
Okay.
But and it's real easy to get these radio IDs. It's a very, very simple step by step.
Okay.
All they do is confirm you've got a radio license. So it's good, and I can't. If you haven't been playing with the DMR side of the radio, it's worth doing. And with some of the code plugs that are out there, it doesn't take that much time to get on a local repeater and start listening. And I keep hoping now that COVID's done. The reason I got into DMR heavy for the public service events is because we actually have public service events that we could share repeaters. They go well over 100 miles, and we could actually go on multiple repeaters that were connected through the DMR network and be able to cover all that path. And then there was a bonus where if we went into an area that did not have a repeater, a DMR or any other type of repeater, but let's just say it didn't, there was no coverage. If it had cell phone coverage, you could use a portable hotspot or a hotspot in your mobile, and you could connect to the DMR network that your buddies are working the event on through your hotspot. So it was kind of a win-win, best of both worlds, where if there's no repeater around, you got cell phone, or if there's no cell phone around, you got repeaters. And it worked out really, really well. Morning, Sean. So.
Sorry, work thing, so.
Yeah. So when you're dealing with, and all the radios are a little bit different, but the squelch level is normally set in the code plugs, and it's something that every radio has kind of its own squelch levels to it. What I mean is that they're more or less sensitive, and the squelch cuts in at certain levels depending on the sensitivity of the radio. So you can go in and actually make your radio more or less sensitive by changing the low end, the normal end, the threshold value, and then the tight level. In other words, if I exceed this, I can't receive anything more. So I never want to exceed that. So I set that as high as I want and still be able to receive. So this is kind of like, in the olden days with the ham radios, you had a squelch button, you turned it left and right and rotated it, made the radio more sensitive or less sensitive by doing that. Well, on commercial radios, there is no squelch button most of the time. So you set it up within the code. And once you set it, usually it doesn't change. With time, it may, or you set it a little low and it gets scratchy, you just go and figure it again. And then there's the monitor type down here, which is the open squelch. That's what you always want to set with our radios, commercial radios. Otherwise, you're not going to hear a whole lot of traffic. It'll only work with certain tones or with certain talk groups, and you don't want that. So you want open squelch all the time. There's talk around and stuff like that. I normally don't set up talk around groups because it confuses me to do that on these radios, and I rather call it simplex than talk around. And talk around, as everybody knows, is you're going on the output side of a repeater usually. So you're talking simplex on the output of a repeater. If any of you listen to the Highway Patrol, all the highway patrol mobiles, when they talk to each other, are on the same channel as the dispatcher is. When they talk to the dispatcher, they actually have to change channels. It's the same way in amateur radio, where you can talk on the output of the repeater, or you can go ahead and talk unit to unit if you happen to be close enough together. Using talk around isn't a great idea when you're running an event, because you may think the dispatcher hears you and they don't. And it's because you're on the output of the repeater and you forgot you put it on there. So it's something I don't really promote too much. If you like it, you think it's a great thing, save it. But quite honestly, I wouldn't do it if I were you. Okay, and then we have the hang times. Everybody that is exactly what it sounds like. You can set up a keypad lock if you want to keep people out of the radios, and you just put a code in through the microphone to get it. I don't use it, but it's there if you want it. And these are commercial radios, so it's one of the reasons that they're set up that way, is because they have to be kind of dummy-proof, because they get all kinds of users that there's a volume button or volume knob and a microphone, and that's all they know how to deal with. So you set it up so it's dummy-proof, where they can't go and change channels on you. So, all right. So I've got my channel display mode here, and you can either do it by frequency and alias. The reason I do alias is because when I set up the channels, which I'll show you here in a minute, it actually gives the frequency that I'm on, and then it tells me what repeater it is or what the call sign of the repeater it is. So that makes it really nice. When I walk in here, I either know what the frequency is, or I just know what the name of the repeater is. Either way, I can find it when I'm going through my talk groups or I'm going through my zones. It makes it real simple. Remember I talked about the power-up designated zone, designated channels? That's what these are, and this is kind of one of my favorites here. And it's not pronounced weeding, but that's the way I spelled it. But anyway, that's the anarchy channel on this particular repeater, and I have a home zone button. When I push that, it goes back to this location again, the anarchy on that particular repeater. So far, so good? Have I confused everyone? No? Okay, good. All right. And pretty much the rest of the stuff I wouldn't mess with too much. If you want to play around with radio locks or lock out your CPS so nobody can mess with it, and that prevents people from downloading it, you can do that. I don't recommend you use any of these because we all forget passwords. And when you forget a password on these, all you can do is basically reload the whole operating system of the radio to undo it. You can do it, but you've bricked your radio is what you've done. Not by intention, but you bricked it, and now you have to go back in there and unbrick it by wiping out the OS that's in there and putting in a new operating system. And then you add your code plug that you carefully saved from the last time you changed it, and you put it into the system. So far, so good? Yeah, everybody's shaking their head. Okay, good. All right, and then over on the left-hand side, and I talked about this a little bit last week, there's two different types of programs that we work with, or two different looks. If you have a Motorola, if you have a Kenwood, if you have a Connect Systems, if you have a Kyocera, if you have, there's about 5 other brands, all their coding, all their menus all look like this. You can't distinguish between them. Then if you have some of the Anytones and others, they actually look more like a spreadsheet than they do this. This is the way. And if you have a Motorola analog radio, and not DMR, they actually look like this too. There's less buttons and stuff in here, but this is the way they're actually configured. And the Kenwoods are that way, and all the name brands are that way. So this is kind of an old architecture that radio operators and radio repair people are real familiar with, which is why they did this. And then the Chinese got involved. And a little visitor here. Training the APRS. Okay. There's another one here. Ooh, look at this fancy one. Wow. We're getting the APR best radios back from the event. Anyway, but they look like this, and you get used to them after a while. I have a preference because I grew up with the analog radios, and E.F. Johnson, some other things. So I actually looked for radios that had this type of setup. What's different about it is the look and feel. However, the technology, the word talk groups, everything else are very, very similar. So let me kind of go through what's interesting on these things or what you kind of need to know and shrink these up. So right now we're in this particular menu, which is the setup for everything that you're going to be doing. So it's under the settings, because it's the setup. You can set up your microphone for a voice-operated transmitter if you really want to do that. You can go ahead and change the buttons on the front of the radio if you want to do that, and go ahead and change what they do and how they work. So right now I have the radios in mind. I have my designated. If I push P1, it goes to my home zone. If I push zone down long, it changes and goes up, down in between the talk group. I'm sorry, between the zones, or up between the zones. And the rest of them, with the exception of volume, pretty much not I don't mess with them too much. There's also hidden buttons on my particular controller, P5, P6, that I got channel up, channel down, and that's because of the way I use the microphone to go up and down between the talk groups and the different channels. Main menu, push P4, get you back, and then cancel P1. And it's, if you looked at the radio, it's got 4 buttons across the front of it. These are those buttons, and you can set them up any way you want. It's nice. You have the difference between a short, push it for a second, or hold it and push it for 2 seconds, and it does different things, short and long. So you have up to, 16 different ways to play with your radio and confuse yourself. You have that option. Okay? There's a one-touch call, which we don't use, but you could, and that's when you're hooked up to a phone patch or a network that will allow you to make phone calls over these radios. And you can also call people radio to radio, and it'll actually trigger. Going home. Okay. You can actually trigger different radios to do different things. There's one network I don't play with, I actually work with, where it causes the radios to basically come alive and beep and tell the operator to pick up the phone. And it acts more like a telephone than it does a real radio. But it's used out in the boonies and stuff like that. And, it's the way they've set it up there. There's user-defined tones. This is something if you want to get away from the original CTCSS design, you probably don't want to use this. And let's just go down to conventional. The way these are set up is we have the zones, we have channels, and then we have digital channels. And as you can see, I have quite a few of them, okay? And this is focused on Bay Area. There really isn't much outside of the Bay Area on here, okay? So it looks like, wow, that guy spent a lot of time coding, and the answer is, well, I do, but I limit the amount of channels and repeaters I look at, so I don't spend as much time as I could be if I included the state of California or wide areas, etc. So we've got the analog channels in there, and everybody who's programmed radios using different programs and codes and stuff like that, they see a screen something like this, and it's got all the different channel settings. It's got your CTCSS tones. You can set up separate for the transmit, separate for the receive. You have a setting in here for Vox. You have a receive-only setting. You have a talk around if you push this one, and then you set up one of the buttons on the front of your radio as talk around. When you push that button, it'll go to the transmit side or the repeater side of the radio. There's a scan list if you want to add this to a particular scan list that you might have. You can have multiple personalities. Yes, the radios do lead to schizophrenia. That is true. And you can actually set up the different personalities, which means the radio actually acts differently with different talk groups, different code groups, whatever. You want to set up that different personality. So I could have a radio that's set up for Northern California and then a radio set up for Southern California with completely different talk groups, radios. And when I change this personality, I can actually make it a Northern California radio or a Southern California radio or a both Northern and Southern California radio by having a third personality.
So you can change its accent, you're saying?
It changes.
Surfer dude accent for SoCal?
Yeah, what it does is it changes if you go over, it'll actually limit right now I'm in a full mode where I've got all these channels exposed. I could go ahead and put a personality 2 in there, and then I would only add the channels in that I wanted for that personality 2. So I could turn my 1,000-channel radio into a 4-channel radio if I wanted to by changing personalities.
Can you set that up to use a hotkey to change that, or do you have to do it through the CPS?
On the personality?
Yeah.
So that particular coding, you set up a button on the front of your radio, and you could flip between the different personalities.
Got it. Cool.
And I think this one's like 8 personalities you can set up. It is both narrow and wideband, and almost everything these days is going over to narrow on the commercial side. Squelch level, you just leave it alone, set it at normal, or you can set a type. But for everything we do, we really don't need a tight squelch. It isn't worth the trouble, and I would just leave it at normal. So far, so good. This is where I type in the channel alias, and as you can see, it's got the frequency, and it's got the repeater identifier, the call sign for that particular repeater. And that's actually what's displayed on the front of my radio or the front of my mobile radio. You actually see that. And it makes life a whole lot easier when you're dealing in analog mode and you want to switch between channels to have it set up this way. So it's really, really convenient. You could also take and have channel alias. That could be Pleasanton. It could be Livermore. Could be Cinderella Bike Ride number 2. Could be almost anything. And you can use that personality 1. You can set up the different personalities just to set up the radio for a particular event. So it makes it real easy that when you give it to an operator that's not very experienced, they would just get a radio that was set up for Cinderella. It would have 4 channels on it, and they can't go too wrong selecting between those 4 channels versus a very complicated DMR ID radio. So you can really make this radio as stupid as you want or very, very intelligent and do a lot of things for you. So the other thing I want to point out is this, the offset. Okay. So as you know, you have to have an offset between the repeater output and the repeater input. And it's either 5 megahertz or it's 2.5 megahertz or it's 0.6. And I always, always, always suggest that you put the offset in here and you apply it. And the reason you do that is because if you think you're really smart, you can go ahead and here's the output frequency. It's a negative offset. So you go over here and you type in because you can say, oh, this minus this is this. But some of us who occasionally get things wrong, if we just type it in there and do apply, it's a lot smarter than we are at times, and it always gives you the right offset number. And you got to remember, in the world of DMR, the offsets, especially in the VHF band, are not normal. They're 2.5 in a lot of cases. I've seen 2, I've seen 5. I've seen them all over the place. So make sure you find out what the offset is. And they usually give you both the transmit and the receive frequencies on their web pages. And it's something to pay attention to because it does surprise you. Okay? So we've got the squelch down here, the squelch mode set up. I'm sorry. We have the CTCSS, and you can go ahead and do, in any way you want or not at all. And that's what opens the repeater. This is the normal drop-down. There is a digital version of that available. So if you have repeaters that are set up with digital squelch, it's right there. And then this is the receive where it actually says, I do work with either a regular tone or a digital tone. And I do work with audio, which means no tone at all. So just some basic things you want to get. Don't forget this button, transmitter timeout, in case you sit on your radio, you leave it in your pocket and do things. Transmit, admit. This is a real important one because you have several options. Never allow, always allow. Channel's free, so it waits and listens. The CTCSS is locked, which means it waits for an absence of tone, or it'll flip on just audio, but on DMR, this doesn't work. This is for an analog single only. So you always want to do this always allow when you've got DMR. Always, always, always. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make is they'll set it in some other way, especially this one, and the radios never work right after that. And it's just, I always go in when I'm troubleshooting and look for this, and I'm always surprised how many times I'll find it. So, anyway. All right, so far so good. So I got all these different channels in here. Okay. And I list as many channels out as I need, as I want, etc. on the analog side. And then I start setting up my zones. And the reason I do the channels first and then the zones is because I can use the channels in multiple zones. Now, in the olden days, we used to call these banks, B-A-N-K-S, and banks didn't work well with DMR, so they called them zones. I don't really know why they made that big difference, but they did do that. That's really the difference. A bank is a zone is a bank in the analog world. Okay, and as you can see, here's the Contra Costa Repeater Association, and I've selected these three, which is the total amount of repeaters that the Contra Costa Repeater Association has. And these are all networked together. So I can actually, depending on where I am in the county, I can use any one of these threes to talk. But if I wanted to go ahead and add more to this, the way I would do it is I'd go ahead and select a channel over here, and I would add it. And that brings another channel into the Contra Costa Repeater Association's zone or bank, zone bank, but zone on these particular radios. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? I'm going to remove that one because I don't want to screw that up. I have all the LARC channels in here. This is off the LARC website, and I put them in there because this is the way when I converse with people, they say, well, it's up on the web page, or I know what's on the web page, and you can see it in there, and I set it up that way just to make life easier for me. All right? Then I have my CERT channels, which you can guess what that's all about. I've got the Sonel digital repeater set up, and I've got a whole bunch of different repeaters on here and stuff like that, which I'll get back to in just a minute. But you can see the zones are analog, and there we've got that's a digital zone. This is for the K6MDD radio that's on top of Mount Diablo. And you can see the difference in the way that the channels work. So before I had a frequency and I had a station ID or the repeater ID, when I start going over into my DMR groups or my digital groups, I have to set up the zones a little bit differently. I'm setting them up by talk groups. So this is a nice little segue into talk groups. This is the K6MDD radio. And I've got a local group, and what that means is if they lose their network and they can't connect to the internet anymore, the repeater still works. It works in local mode, and it works in a digital local mode, so you could actually communicate through it. So it'd be kind of like a great big analog setup, but it's handling digital traffic. And that's why that one's on there. So if they lose that, the repeater is still useful for local traffic, and it still has the coverage that it would normally have. It just can't communicate with the internet anymore. I've also got the zone in there for Northern California, which doesn't get used a lot. There's the worldwide one that we talked about earlier, that there's a lot of traffic on it, but it's very short in length. You will literally hear people from all over the world on this channel. We've got the Diablo Talk group in here, and that's a local group for the Diablo Radio Club. And it's just like LARC has their own digital channel, okay? And digital talk group. And this works on 3 or 4 repeaters that would be all linked together. So if we had a great big public service event, we could stretch the communications link between all those different repeaters and be able to communicate hopefully a whole lot further out there. There's a California group. This is for something called fusion radio. I'm not going to get into that. It's another form of DMR, but it's a little bit different. It's still TDMA though. So these are the talk groups that I kind of work with on the Diablo repeater, okay? And I know that all these talk groups exist on the Diablo repeater because I've actually looked them up on the websites and stuff, and I've looked into the Brandmeister networking. And these are all available. These talk groups are all available on that repeater. So far, so good? Somebody, anybody?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So does anybody know where Weiderman Hill is? If you had an airplane and you went from Mount Diablo south by southwest, and you flew 5 miles, you would first go over Diablo. You would then go over Weiderman. They cover an incredibly similar piece of property in the San Ramon Valley and the Tri-Valley area. They don't have the reach into Sacramento, but that's okay because it minimized the traffic out here. So we've got the Weiderman Hill repeater or DMR repeater, and I've got some of the same talk groups on it, but I've got Anarchy on this one. And Anarchy is this fun little group, and 5150 should be on here too. Let me find it real quick. By the way, this is kind of what happens is you find it a repeater that isn't right, and you end up doing this. You set it up wrong or you're missing something. Let me find the W's. So anyway, I've got to program an additional channel. I must have taken it out, but this particular repeater, which has a slightly different coverage pattern and everything else, is less busy than the Diablo repeater. The Diablo digital repeater has this worldwide thing going constantly. So you can have two conversations on a digital repeater at the same time, but this one has such a range to it. Both of those channels get very busy a lot of the time. And quite honestly, if you're playing around and making a lot of QSOs, it's great for that, but it isn't much good for anything else. It just doesn't, it's very recreational type of repeater. And we have all these different things that go on within that repeater. By the way, they also have a local 2 for the other time slot, for their time slot 1. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we've got Weiderman Hill. These are the ones I've selected. And the Anarchy is my kind of chosen one. That's the repeater, the talk group that I listen to the most often and have a lot of fun with. So the Anarchy is part of the 5150 group. So far, so good? Everything look different? Yes, no, somebody?
I'm good.
Okay. So we've got hotspots in here. And the hotspot, by the way, as everybody knows, hotspot, and then I had D for Diablo, and EH, that's on English Hill in Marin County. So that when I look at these on my list here, I know what repeater, what frequencies I've set the talk group up on, and where that's located. So I'm...
What's DX?
DX, I don't remember offhand. I know it's I just don't remember offhand which one that is. It's down in the South Bay. But anyway, I don't remember. I've got a little list in the car of what's what. Here's one of those 5150 things I was talking about earlier. That's in Livermore. Seems to be very suitable in there. And we've got the Lark channel there on this one, this particular talk group. So if I call up the Livermore repeater, which is in this here, I'll actually see Livermore, NorCal, California, 5150, and then the Lark group. And the reason it's set up that way is that particular repeater has less talk groups than, let's say, Diablo. It's got a limited amount. There are repeaters that are set up really for local communications, but with DMR, you can bridge between repeaters very, very, very easily. So if you look in Marin County, as you look at the Sonoma repeaters, and you look at the repeaters up in English Hill, and you look up even further north from there, you'll notice they have a limit of the amount of talk groups they have. Most of the talk groups they have are for local traffic only. And they have a local traffic just on that repeater, and then they'll have one or two network ones, which will give them a lot more range between different repeaters. All right, so I've bored everybody so far?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting.
Okay. So far, so good. So we talked about all these different things. We've got all these two-tone services, smart calls, DMF, personalities. We talked about that a little bit. We've just got the one personality. You can put emergency operations and have a hot button on your radio. I wouldn't suggest you do this, but people do that. And then we've got DMR services. And you remember how I've been talking about talk groups a lot? So talk groups are these little shared channels that'll pop up on numerous repeaters. And all you got to do is have the right talk group, like 5150, with the right coding for that talk group, and then you can add it to multiple repeaters by just going ahead and creating the frequency or adding the frequency to it. So let's take a look at the talk groups. So these are all the talk groups that I use on this radio. And the way this thing works is you basically, there's a very big list that's put out by Brandmeister and other stuff. And if you go to the repeaters that are listed on all those little, in the PowerPoint slide, if you actually take a look at some of those, it'll tell you, yeah, I've got a set of repeaters. They're all over California. And then you select a particular repeater. It gives you the frequency it's on, which is kind of important. But it also gives you the talk groups that it supports. So what I've done is all these different talk groups that I have are of interest to me. Either now or at one time they were interesting to me. And what I do is I leave talk groups alone at all times. Once I put it in there, I don't change them. I leave them in place all the time because I may need to go back to it at some point. But I leave them all in there, and I have all these multiple. And the best way to handle this is to take a look at the talk groups and figure out what you want to listen to talk group-wise. Once you've got that, go ahead and set up the talk group. And as you can see, it says like this one here is Baycom. That's a field that I can go ahead and edit. It's a group call, which means many, many, many people can hear it. Okay. This particular number comes out of Brandmeister or whatever networking that you're using, but it's a unique number for this particular talk group. So this number here actually allows me to listen to Baycom. This number here lets me listen to NorCal 5150. Okay? And these numbers, you get these all off the websites for Brandmeister, or you get them off the individual repeater website. And Brandmeister no longer publishes names for talk groups. They only publish the number. So it gets a little dodgy sometimes, which is why you've got to look at the individual repeater, because the individual repeaters has it by the name and by the number. Now, there is a cross-reference available on the Brandmeister and other talk groups websites that actually will tell you that 95150 is the NorCal 5150 talk group. And that's where you pick up the names of the different groups and stuff like that. So if you're looking at the Mount Diablo website, okay, and it's got the number 31606 or 31666, that means they support that particular talk group. And you can actually go to the Brandmeister or other websites, plug in 31666, and it'll tell you that that's Anarchy, and they support that. Okay? So I always like to get all my talk groups because my talk groups, I'm basically going to need those in order to set up the repeater. Once you've got those, it's pretty simple to set up the repeater. Okay? I'm going to just touch on these down here a little bit. You notice it goes to private, from group call to private call. Technically, I can select this channel and I can call this guy directly if I want to. Okay? It's not something I do, but I could. So you're going, well, Chris, why do you even have that on your radio? Well, the reason I have it on my radio is because when I'm looking at the digital display, this actually appears. So it'll tell me it's something in Europe, and that's their actual ID that's available. Okay? And you remember that thing that every radio needs its own ID? That's what this is. So you could actually look this up and see where the guy is, et cetera, et cetera. You can also take, and on these private calls, going to the radio ID net, there's basically everybody's name, where they're located, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can go ahead and, because it comes out in an Excel spreadsheet, you can actually merge these together. So if the guy has his first name or his last name or both on a particular, registered and shows up on the Excel spreadsheet, you can have the front of your radio not display their call sign, but display their name or their name and call sign, which is kind of cool. And if you're working a big event, it's nice to have all the radios identified by the operator's name or by the operator's location. And we do that sometimes with special events where we'll actually reprogram digital radios to show the event or the position or the post that they're calling from rather than an individual. These things are always private calls. You never have a group call for this. It just won't work, so don't worry about it. No big deal. But these are the ones that you're actually going to talk to the different groups on, the group calls here. All right? So you say, Chris, how do I do this? How do I set up a DMR channel? So remember, we've got the repeater, right? We've got the group call, we've got the we have the repeater frequency, we've got the offset on this thing, and whether or not we want to have a hotspot's a different question here. But we have to set up, the way I do is the repeater name and then what my group call or what my group is in this particular, that's my alias, my display. And then I have down here the groups. Oops. So I can go ahead and set this up. This will happen sometimes with some of these programs. Okay. Where, remember I showed you all my group numbers, talk groups? Well, here they are again. So I take a particular repeater, and this one happens to be my hotspot. So hotspot worldwide, and because I already put my talk groups into the program, I just look for whatever I want. In this case, I wanted worldwide. I click on that. I now have this particular channel all set up for the hotspot, and I can listen to the worldwide. Okay? Make sense? On a hotspot, you always want to have low power. On the other, the FCC says you only need as much power to talk as you set it for whatever power you need. Don't get excessive. Almost everything I do is high power, though. It just works out better that way, and nobody seems to do it. And the transmit admit is always, there's a channel idle, and there's color code free, and you always want to put it on always because we use both always allows you to jump on the channel, and Kerchunk wants to go ahead and open up the repeater. And the color code free is made up for systems that are pretty much business systems that we know we've only got 2 slots to talk on. So they're selecting between 1 or 2 different color codes. color codes are equivalent of a CT CSS code. It's the same sort of thing. Then it's got the timeout time to review this real quick. You pin the alias up here. My internet connection is unstable. Okay. The color code, that you will find on the website. You will also find the repeater slot, time slot. You got to get these right, because if you don't, it doesn't work. You know, whether you want the voice, say you're on this channel, you can do that. The radios I have, you can actually program in the name of the channel, and it'll announce it. On the Fire radios we have, because you could be in a situation where you turn the knob and you can't see what's going on, or you don't want to look down, it'll actually say this is the channel you're on. Okay? And then if you're going to have a scan list, which I do on this one, I go ahead and I list the scan list there. And the scan list is something you set up separately. But it's put in the alias, the digital ID is something we talked about earlier. Their color code, you get that off the website for the particular repeater. The repeater time slot, you get that off the website for the particular repeater. Okay? And then if you're going to add a scan list, the other thing that you have to program in there is the frequencies, followed by the talk groups. Is that real painful? Yes, no?
No, it's really well explained.
Okay. Yeah, if you do this often enough, you kind of you search for easier ways to do it. Okay. So we've got this all set up in here, and I now have I've gone ahead and I've set up this particular channel, Hotspot Worldwide, Life is Good, and I'm going to go ahead, and then the next thing I'm going to do is add it to my zones. So I go over to my hotspot zone. I go over to my list of channels that are available, and I can find all my hotspot stuff. I've got it all programmed over here. But I look for this HS because that stands for hotspot, and I know the frequency pair that I chose, the color code I chose, and the time slot I chose is relevant for my hotspot. And if you go over here to English Hill, although it may be the same group call or the same call group that I'm trying to talk to, like Anarchy, it may be the same one. It'll have a different frequency because I'm on a different repeater. So I've got to get the groups set up correctly. I've got to get the frequencies set up correctly. And then I go ahead and I drag it into the zone, which is what this is. So this is all the channels in my hotspot for the world, basically. All right? And the really, really cool thing about a hotspot is if the time slots or if the repeaters become incredibly busy, and let's just say you're having trouble getting through on a particular repeater, it's down in the South Bay, there's just too much traffic and all the locals, you can always pop out your hotspot, and you can go ahead and take that hotspot and connect it to your radio and start talking to the hotspot directly into the network. So let's say all the local repeaters are on worldwide and they aren't coming off because everybody's got, you remember the traffic that's on one repeater is the same traffic that's on the other repeater, which is the same traffic that could be on another repeater, and everybody's sitting there and tying up the repeater with worldwide. Well, I can actually go onto my hotspot and get around that problem because I'm now networked, and I can talk directly from one radio to the other through hotspots going through the network. So it's a real cool way to get around it. In fact, the comp support is actually being set up with hotspots because we have all kinds of telephone cards. We also have satellite connections. And I'll be able to jump onto basically any one of these groups that I want to at any time using the hotspot and going network, which makes it real easy for me to communicate to one or more people anywhere in the local area around the world because I'm using a combination of cellular technology for the internet connection and then internet to the network back into local repeaters and out again. And I can be selective as to who I'm talking to Because if you remember that single call, I was showing that earlier where we had that one guy that said private call. I can do a private call to private call through a hotspot, and it'll connect for me. So it's just kind of like having a phone, but it's on your radio, and you can communicate back and forth. So hotspots are really cool. They're wonderful to have in your house. If you have a hotspot in your house, you probably don't need a base station. You really don't. And even in your car, if you leave the hotspot on either a local cellular network through your cell phone, or you can actually buy hotspots with the cellular connection built into it. And this is for DMR. You can go ahead and just use that to communicate with other people and not worry about the mobile radio in the car with the big antenna and all that stuff. You just use your handheld with a microphone. Works great. It's a real quick and easy way to get around network problems, repeater problems, moving from car to car. I rent cars a lot, so I'll take a hotspot and a radio with me, and I can jump on the hotspot, connect it through my cell phone, and I can talk DMR pretty much anywhere I am as long as there's a cell phone connection. So it's kind of a cool way to do things. All right, so we've been at this for a while. Are there any questions or doubts or comments or anything like that?
I have a question that goes back to something pretty basic. When I first bought my DMR radio, I obtained a subscriber ID. Is that different than the radio ID?
That's the radio ID.
Okay.
So what happened is a few years back, there were several groups giving out the radio IDs, and they all said, this is a really bad idea. Let's all consolidate. So they came out with this one particular organization that's all volunteer that now issues those. And depending on where you got your number from, they have included it in the radio ID list that's out there right now. If you needed to change it, it gets a little ugly, but the easiest way to change it is to go in there and have them basically delete the old number and have them issue you a new one. That's the quickest way to turn it around. But all your old stuff, like the particular number you have, is registered and it should work. And if you want, go to that radioid.net sign. You can actually go find that information on there and update it if you wanted to. But it should work just fine.
Okay, got it.
I was just going to say that was my mistake at the beginning. I didn't understand that a DMR ID was a radio ID. That's what we're doing there.
Yeah.
I was poking around a little bit, and it seems like there's a lot of chatter about, they're trying to clamp down on the number of them. But it seems like a handy thing to have just in case you wanted to, have two radios on at the same time and not cause problems. What's the trick to getting a second one?
Oh, you just send a email to their tech support group, and you tell them, I will have radios that will be operated by other people at the same time. So where it gets really bad is, let's say you're talking to a repeater and your wife or partner is on one of the talk groups and you're on another talk group, and the system hears and sees that number. If it sees it, I think it's for 2 seconds, 3 times in a minute, it knocks you out for an hour.
Okay. So it's just, if somebody was looking, they would see, like if my wife, if she has a call sign, but if I have two DMR ideas, somebody would see her call sign come up or something like that if they were going to look her up, but she would be using it, and that's okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah. So like I say, I have multiples because I know what happens with my radios, and I've already made the mistake once where I did have radios that were all operating at the same time, and it took us all off the air at the same time. So, yeah, it was not pleasant.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hey, Chris, I got a question.
Sure.
One thing I've noticed, and I've not tried other DMR repeaters throughout the East Bay because I'm obviously closer to Diablo, but one thing I've noticed on Diablo is on time slot 2, it's their dynamic talk groups, which it looks like the majority of the people around here like using D-Star. So are a lot of the other repeaters in the area set up the same way, so where I could just listen to DMR and whatever talk groups happen to be active, rather than to wait or chunk the repeater and then take over a dynamic mode time slot.
Yeah, so what he's talking about is the DMR repeater that's on Mount Diablo actually works with D-Star and a couple of other TDMAs, and you have to chunk it to tell you, for it to know what mode you're going to be using. It's one of the things that it's an interesting repeater, but like if you want to listen to hear anything, to set the timer up, and it won't hear it if you don't chunk the channel. You just ask to ID what you're looking for. So it says, oh, okay, you're a listener. Okay, fine, I'll let that go ahead, and it lets you start listening to the worldwide communications on that particular talk group. But that's what you've got to do. And it's just, for me, it's I find it really annoying. So that's why I use Weiderman Hill and a couple of other ones a lot more, because the Diablo group, not only is it tied up a lot, but there's all this stuff that you have to do to make it work that's different than others. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess that's the justification for a hotspot, even in the field.
It is. I find that I use the hotspots a lot. It's a whole lot simpler, especially if I'm in the Bay Area, I can actually route between the different repeaters and stuff like that, and it works. I can do that, go from repeater to repeater to repeater. But if I'm on a hotspot, I don't have to do that. It just kind of works. It's cheating, I know. So any other questions? So what I think we ought to do for another text.
Yep,
yes.
I think a few years ago when I talked to you about DMR, there were competing standards, competing protocols. Are they all playing nicely together, or did one win out over the other? That's one question. The second one is, does it matter which radio I buy? Can it talk with all the protocols active?
So to answer the second question first, doesn't matter on the radios. Okay. Anything you buy will work. Okay. So the competing standards, there's two different types of competing standards that were going on at one time. Some of it is still going on where D-Star competes with DMR, and it's more of a, do you like red or do you like blue, or do you like apples or oranges? They do roughly the same things. It's just how they do it. I find DMR a whole lot easier to use than D-Star. D-Star just kind of made me crazy because I had to set up the call every time I did it, and I got annoyed with it pretty quickly. So those are all doing. Now, one of the other things that Sean's talking about is way back when there was actually a different network out there. So there's a big network called Brandmeister, and Brandmeister is this really cool group that goes across the world. And if you haven't looked at the Brandmeister website, you really ought to spend 30 minutes looking at it. But there were other TDMA with slightly different networking connections that were competing, so to speak, with Brandmeister, and it required a different type of programming. So when you get into your code plug, this code plug, the way this one works is pretty much plug and play. Back in those, we actually had to set up different time standards and stuff in order to use the alternate network, and it became much more complex at the time. So all of that's gone away now, and everybody's resolved, and they pretty much use either the C network or the Brandmeister. Your radios will work with either one of them.
Thanks. Thanks.
Sure. All right, anything else?
I was going to ask, I apologize because I've been in and out a little bit with kids. The groups.io LARC DMR page I was just looking at, and there was a spot on it to post code plugs. Like there's a folder for 878 and a 380, I think it was.
Okay.
But there's nothing in there right now. Is there some way that LARC people are sharing code plugs right now?
Well, we can put a call out for people to populate, and I'm sure people will. But what I'd like to do is, on another tech session, is that I showed you basically how this particular system works and how the Motorola looks and the programming and setting up a code plug for the Kenwoods and these Connect system radios. What I'd like to do on another tech session is to show you the alternate to that, which is what I call the spreadsheet design. And we could actually because a lot of people have Anytone radios or some of the other ones out there that use the spreadsheet design. And you have to kind of, once you've seen this, you kind of get an understanding of how the different call groups work and stuff like that. When you see it on the spreadsheets, if you enjoy looking at spreadsheets, which is a discussion into itself, it is a different type of programming you may find easier. And I'd like to do that during another session. It's either myself or somebody who does it a lot with those particular spreadsheets. Actually, I have a tech session on that. It'll get people to know what the differences are.
Yeah, the LARC DMR Groups IO subgroup has not been very active. I think there's only one thing on there right now. So we definitely want to start getting people to post code plugs up there, as well as any other useful stuff.
So I've got some code plugs that I'll pop in there that for different types of radios. And I'll pop this one in there too. But I think there's some 878s out. I think there's some 878 code plugs I have. And you just have to remember that they're set up for somebody else's preference. But if you have, if you start out with a code plug like this, there's an awful lot of stuff that, you want the LARC channels, you want the Carla channels. Most of the stuff you're going to want, you may not want the San Ramon CERT, but you can go into the San Ramon CERT and you can change those channels for the Livermore Pleasanton CERT group. You could do that real easily. And it's just going ahead and setting up different channels down here and then adding them to that particular zone. It's pretty simple and straightforward.
Yeah, one quick comment. At least so I have an Anytone 878, at least in my CPS, I think it's in yours too. You don't have to accept an entire code plug. You can start with that as a template, but you can import and export pieces.
Right.
More like the spreadsheet design that Chris is talking about.
Yeah, and if you go up here, I didn't cover it today because it's a lot to do. There's a lot there. But you can actually, and this is the one I use most often, is the importing and exporting of digital contacts because they're always changing. And I can export my current list into a spreadsheet. I can then look for what's changed, fix it, and then import it back in again. I can also do that with my channels, and it'll allow me in a spreadsheet format to go ahead and set up the channels that I have and work on a spreadsheet looking type of thing rather than what I showed you today, okay? Which is it's just a different way of doing things. But this is more of the spreadsheet design. In fact, I can probably just see if I can open this. We get ready to shut down?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm done as far as net control.
Okay, good. So, all right, we're going to start cleaning the truck up here. It's downloaded. Let me see if I can. Oh, I'm sharing. Sorry about that. I can't do it because of the way I'm configured right now. But I can download all the different channels I have. That. Get rid of that. Yeah. So anyway, I can bring it into a spreadsheet. I can make the changes I want on that spreadsheet. Then I can upload it, and it will fill in that channel part of the programming that I was showing you earlier. So if you're very comfortable with spreadsheets and you can kind of, you want to go that route, you can definitely use that with these type of programs. And with the groups or basically the contacts worldwide, it's the only way to go is on a spreadsheet. because when you go ahead and you do that, you're going to always add your IDs back into the spreadsheet, and you're also going to want to get rid of, delete stuff that you know you're never going to listen to. The more radio ID contacts that you have, the slower the radio works. So if you're just interested in Northern California, go to the radioid.net and then download the Northern California group only, and then put that in your radio. And you can pick and choose right across the board any group that you want to be using or any area you want to be using. All right, we're going to wrap it up in here. It's been fun. And I'll talk to George about scheduling the other version of software here, and I'll get some software codes I'll get some code plugs put into our LARC group, and we're going to have this recording available to anybody